What's in your pockets right now? What would those items say about you? On April 14, 1865, when Lincoln was assassinated in Ford's Theater, in his pockets were a pair of eyeglasses, a lens polisher, a handkerchief, a watch fob, a pocket knife, and a brown wallet. Inside the brown wallet were some newspaper clippings and Confederate money. Now, it probably strikes you as it struck me when I was reading Saraval's excellent Assassination Vacation in preparation for this episode, which is going to be listener questions, and we're going to be talking about presidential assassinations among other topics, many topics. It struck me, what's the deal with the Confederate money? Well, maybe related to the other items in the wallet. Those newspaper clippings, they were of positive reactions to Lincoln's speeches and actions in various newspapers. So he was holding it as kind of a little bit of positive reinforcement that he could turn to in his wallet. And the Confederate money, it looks like, since he had just visited Richmond, recently captured by Union troops, was a bit of a trophy. We're going to be talking about Lincoln and many other topics. Brian Moritz asks, I just listened to your Electoral College episode and I loved it. I learned so much. Thanks to Ben Sawyer from the Road to Now podcast for the tip. Here's a hypothetical for you. Had the convention not settled on the Electoral College, but had done Congress. We're speaking in Twitter speak here, so had done Congress means had made the Congress the one who selects the president. Will we have the popular vote of president today? All right. So in other words, he's saying, just like what happened with the 17th Amendment, where the vote of senators used to be like state legislatures, and now it's a popular vote in each state. If the Constitutional Convention of 1787 had said, look, let Congress pick the president, would we have now ended up with a popular vote faster than if, we had this Electoral College was invented? It's interesting, and it would be tempting to say that, yeah, of course, because things get more democratic over time in America on a lot of fronts, and people would want a popular vote and take it away from Congress. But I would suggest 2 points. One is that constitutional measures have a way of acquiring a sacred value over time. I wonder if that ability of Congress picking the president wouldn't have been spun over time into a more noble and sacred and unselfish value of these people holding the flame of liberty, picking someone who's excellent, these members of Congress as the people's representatives would be the best judges, and they wouldn't submit to somebody who is a demagogue or something like that. You could see that argument being spun, and I wonder how long that argument might last. Something else. If you change it so that now the Congress is picking the president, the big concern of the convention, the reason it doesn't happen in 1787 in the document, is that they're afraid that the president's going to become a tool of Congress. He's going to lose all effective power, and he's going to be doing favors in order to keep his place. Okay? If we think that those constitutional framers were correct in that assumption, and the presidency might be weaker, and it might become more like a manager for Congress. We don't elect a speaker right now directly, and no one calls for that, even though the speaker has enormous power, and that possibly the people should weigh in on that office. We don't elect a speaker. Maybe we would never elect this president at all, because maybe there'd be less interest in it, because it would be, in fact, a weaker position than it is now. I don't have the answer to your question, Brian, but thanks for asking it, and thanks for listening to the podcast. Now, here's Ophir Thaler. What he says is, This might be an oversimplification, but reading the history of American presidential assassinations, successful and attempted, my impression is that they generally don't come about as part of broader violent movements or aggrieved groups. Rather, it appears that they are mostly done by individuals with no relation to broader movements, often for odd reasons. For example, it seems particularly odd that a president as controversial as Reagan would face an attempted assassination unrelated to his actual politics. As you discussed in your wonderful series about him, Lincoln and McKinley appear to be prominent exceptions. Firstly, would you agree with this observation? Secondly, can you think of any cultural or historic reasons why this is the case in the U.S., while assassins of heads of states in other countries, Rabin, Gandhi, Sadat, are often related to broader political battles? I mean, yes, I do agree. Thanks for the question, Ophir. I do agree. This is my take on American presidential assassinations and attempted assassinations generally. Guiteau, Chaglos, Hinckley, Oswald, the attempted assassin of FDR, Joe Zaranga. It's this pretty common thread of a person that's delusional, that's seeking some amount of fame for some purpose, but that purpose is very inward and not part of a broader social movement. The only part there I disagree is that I would actually put both Chalgos, McKinley's assassin, and Booth in that category as well. Now, you might be surprised with that about Booth, because for Booth it appears that he was part of this broader movement, and I suppose he was. I suppose there are some people that were happy to hear about the assassination of Lincoln, but it wasn't the norm of society. Jefferson Davis, for instance, was not very pleased to learn of that incident. I don't think for the average person, this was the way that one conducted themselves. War is one thing, assassination is another. We have actually evidence of Booth's own reaction, because he did live a few more days into his, and wrote in his diary. And one of the things you hear him write is that, my gosh, I've had to crawl through the mud and starve. He thought that there would be this great hero's welcome for him, which there absolutely was not. While he might have been associated with a movement or sympathized with a movement, he was delusional in the extent of the movement, in the extent that he was conspiratorial, in the extent that Lincoln was about to establish like a dictatorship or be a tyrant over America. And there wasn't as much agreement for that. One of the things he says is like, this is the way I'm treated for what Brutus was honored for? What Tell was honored for? I mean, Booth is comparing himself to Brutus and William Tell. So I think that signals a lot about his mentality. His sister, Asia Booth, was had received a visit from him in Philadelphia a little bit before the assassination, and noted his mental condition. A desperate turn towards the evil had come, she wrote in her memoir, and wild tirades, which were the very fever of his distracted brain and tortured heart. So I would put him right in that group. Guiteau, Garfield's assassin, the history books originally say that he was an office seeker, and that's the way the press spun it, because his words as he shoots Garfield is I'm a stalwart, and now author is president. So he associates himself with one group, the group of the political group, faction of the incoming Republican president, Chester Arthur. And it's not very good for Arthur, but I think most people in the country realized that this was a deluded, crazy man that was well established, if not in the beginning, by the time of his trial, where he defended himself. And, so there's no reason for us much later, getting distance from this event, to look at it any differently. He wasn't an office seeker. He was thrown out of James Blaine's office for just being a pest. There was no chance he was receiving any office at all. So this seems to be more common to me. Giuseppe Joe Zangara, the FDR's attempted assassin, just bragged about killing presidents and kings. Hinckley was ready to kill Jodie Foster, and Reagan was a stop on the way. It had nothing to do with politics whatsoever. He was planning to go up to Brown, perhaps, and kill Jodie Foster. So killing Reagan was a way to to do some kind of bizarre, diluted way that Jodie Foster would be impressed by him. You ask, can you think of any cultural or historical reasons why it's different, say, from other countries, like somebody like Sadat or Gandhi? Yeah, these are like very big, charismatic leaders, and changing that person changes a lot about the country. And I'm not saying there's nothing there in America, but I suppose the checks and balances help a little in this department. That when McKinley was assassinated, we didn't have a great anarchist revolution, and I believe that assassination also was a little bit diluted, if he could be loosely associated with a movement, certainly. By assassinating McKinley, although he was a bit of a symbol of capitalism at the time, putting in Theodore Roosevelt did not change that equation whatsoever. Most of Theodore Roosevelt's really progressive or anywhere near socialistic type proposals, and he certainly wouldn't use that term, would have come in 1912 when he was running as a progressive candidate. As a candidate, as a president, he had the old guard of the Republicans to contend with. It wasn't a radical change to do anything like that. Okay, so Emily Glankler writes me, I just wanted to reach out and say that I love your podcast. I am a social studies teacher who's trying to get something similar started, and so truly appreciate the time and work that goes into creating what you have. I started my anti-social studies podcast, originally for my students and friends. But I love creating it, and I want to grow my audience. I was wondering if you could give me some advice. I'm creating good content, but I'm struggling to break past my friends and acquaintances to build a broader audience. How do you tackle that? And how do you go about approaching experts to be on your show? Do you do a lot of networking in advance or just reach out to people whose work you admire? Emily Glankler of the Antisocial Studies podcast at antisocialstudies.org. Podcasting. Well, I guess I'm now qualified to give advice on it. I've been doing it for 12 years. I have a pretty simple philosophy about podcasts, and I think it's how I started, that you have to niche. It has to be really, really narrow. Podcasting now is a bit harder than ever before because there are so many podcasts out there. And I actually think while the audience is growing in terms of number of people, while I even felt it explode a bit when the iPad started coming out and you started getting more, Stitcher and podcasts on the phone. There's so many more podcasts out, and there is something going on now where there's a number of corporate podcasts and podcast networks that I believe are really kind of over-contenting, and some of them are very good. It is taking some of the space on the available directories, namely iTunes, and we'll see where those goes. My prediction is that if it's not a good cast, they won't survive. So my advice and my approach to podcasting is I always tell people it's not about a podcast about hockey. It's a podcast about goalies. I think more than ever, we have to think about the medium and what it offers. The whole idea of it has always been to do something that can't be done on the other networks. I think the advice that I gave to you, which you're picking up on, is, one thing is that as social studies, that's a word that's rooted in the education world versus history, which everybody's involved with. So when you do social studies, then you are telling people about a message that this is for teachers or people in class. Or you can do something funny like, this is what I wish I learned in social studies class. I know there's a similar show like that, so there's... Oh, in terms of the guests that I have on this program, yeah, they come from book publishers, usually people that are doing a book. They will come to me. I select guests that I feel have something to say that can add to my own knowledge, supplement my own knowledge. I'm really looking for guests that are, different. They have a different viewpoint. I don't love the guests that are on 5 different other podcasts after mine, but I'm not going to turn down Chris Matthews either. Come on. I'm hoping for someone that can add to the body of knowledge that I have, that the listeners have, so that later you're probably going to hear me quoting some of these people so that we have something when a political issue comes up that's relevant to history. Rather than going out and investing a lot in marketing, I think the most important thing is picking something original, very narrow, where you can add value that you like talking about, obviously. Jack Rice, Al Trout, big marketing people, had a very successful book. They said, you don't position yourself, you are positioned. You come up with a name, you are positioned. Pick social studies, you're going to do some of the things like you're starting to do and you're starting to get some results with, which is great, which is going to bring out teachers and the educational side of it and making that more interesting. And remember, if you don't like doing it, put that microphone down. You're done. Gotta love it. So this is becoming more important, and I'm certainly by no means the podcasting expert, but believe me, go to Libsyn, go to like Dave Jackson. Those are the people you want for advice. But if you just as me, as a guy that's been talking to a microphone this is going to become more important because a lot of people are doing it. And I strongly encourage you to do it. Everyone, I shouldn't say everyone should have a podcast, but everyone that wants to should have a podcast. And good luck. Everybody check it out. Anti-Social Studies podcast, Emily Glankler. Check it out on iTunes or, antisocialstudies.org. Sitting for a portrait in the 19th century is not an easy thing. It takes a long time. So you're going to tend to talk to your artist while you're doing this. And this happens to Lincoln with a painter, Francis Carpenter, his painter. He has a talk with Lincoln, and he records what Lincoln says. And because of that, we may know a little bit about the events surrounding the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln shocks most of his cabinet on July 22nd, 1862, the second year of the Civil War, when he rises and says to the members he's thinking of, and he's prepared a draft of a proclamation that would free all of the slaves in the Confederate States. What's more, he did not call the cabinet together for advice, but rather to lay the draft before them. Now, there's various accounts. Secretary Chase, who was more radical on abolition than Lincoln had been, is astonished. And he at first says, there's certain things he'd like it to go farther. For instance, if you're going to emancipate slaves, he wants to see that the owners are not compensated. That's his position on it. But then, according to Secretary War Stanton, who's in the room, Chase has some second thoughts about issuing this proclamation. He actually says to Lincoln, it goes farther than anything I've recommended. For Secretary of State Seward, he supports this proclamation, but he does ask Lincoln to consider foreign reaction. Might France and England intervene because of the cotton crop, to preserve the cotton crop they need? But the painter, Francis Carpenter, also has Seward saying something else. He says, if you issue it now, we just had the Peninsular Campaign. It was unsuccessful. McClellan's attempt to take Richmond, beaten back. You issue it now, it might be seen as the last measure of a desperate government. Seward says, why don't you wait until there's a military victory, and then you can hang the proclamation on the American eagle. Other, cabinet members react differently. Some are really in support of this proclamation. Attorney General Blair, who's not there, is concerned about the midterms, expresses that later. Midterms in 1862 are coming up. But according to Carpenter, Seward's advice struck Lincoln with great force. He does just what Seward advises. He waits for a victory. Well, really kind of a half victory, with at least the Confederate forces being pushed out of Maryland and retreating the field at Antietam, even if it was at the cost of great Union life. So rather than issuing the proclamation in July, he issues it in September after Antietam and has it take effect January 1st, 1863. I'm going to read from that proclamation. Whereas on the 22nd day of September, in the year of our Lord, 1862, a proclamation was issued by the President of the United States containing, among other things, the following, to wit, that on the first day of January, in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then thenceforth and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no acts or repress such persons or any of them in any efforts they may make for their actual freedom. Now, picture that instead of me reading this to you, I'm writing it. You're seeing it. I'm going to put a yellow highlight on certain words here, and these words are right now will be forever free. Let's remember that. Continue. That the executive will, on the first day of January aforesaid by proclamation, designate the states and parts of states, if any, in which the people thereof respectively shall then be in rebellion against the United States, and the fact that any state or the people thereof shall on that day be in good faith represented in the Congress of the United States by members chosen thereto, at elections wherein a majority of the qualified voters of such state shall have participated, shall, in the absence of strong countervailing testimony, be deemed conclusive evidence that such state and the people thereof are not then in rebellion against the United States. Okay? So he's slamming the gauntlet down, but he's also saying there's a way out here. Continues. Now therefore I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, in time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, do, on this first day of January in the year of our Lord, 1863, and in accordance with my purpose to do so publicly, proclaimed for the full period of 100 days, from the day first above mentioned, order and designate as the states and parts of the states wherein the people thereof respectively are in this day in rebellion against the United States, the following to wit. Now, my yellow highlight marker is out again, and I'm going to highlight the words necessary war measure, because it's important. Now, here's the regions that he's saying are in rebellion. Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, except certain parishes, Jefferson, New Orleans, areas around New Orleans. Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, except the 48 counties designated as West Virginia, and also the counties of Berkeley, Accomack, Northampton, Elizabeth City, York, Princess Anne, and Norfolk, including the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth, and which accepted parts are for the present left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. Yellow highlight out on that, on the words for the present, at which the accepted parts are for the present left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. And by virtue of the power, and for the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are, henceforth shall be free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. He adds a note now that isn't the celebrated part of this proclamation and not one you hear about much, but it's in there. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence unless in necessary self-defense. And I recommend to them that in all cases when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. And I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. Okay, Another important line there. This is added to the proclamation, not in September, but in the January final proclamation that is issued. Notice that among the many things, first of all, the word garrison. This is a 1863 focus test group word. It is, there were no focus groups. But in other words, it's a word that sounds good to some Northerners who are on the fence about emancipation, but like the fact that we need military relief. The garrison word is something that a lot of governors who otherwise don't support abolition can get behind. Notice among all the things listed, there's not yet combat. It's garrison, positions, stations, other places, manned vessels. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, highlight there, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. Okay, now, you've got a lot of reaction. Hurrah for old Abe, says Benjamin Wade, who's not always a fan of the reticent President Lincoln as he sees it. Frederick Douglass says it's the greatest event in our nation's history. William Lloyd Garrison, the most foremost abolitionist, said it's a great historic event, sublime in its magnitude, and beneficent in its far-reaching consequences. The ambassador to Great Britain, Charles Francis Adams, says that now this annihilates all agitation for recognition in Great Britain. Reaction's going to obviously be less so in people in the North who don't agree with emancipation. The Cincinnati Enquirer said that the proclamation represented the complete overthrow of the Constitution that Lincoln swore to protect and defend. Obviously, Jefferson Davis was no fan. Among other things, he calls it a gesture of impotent rage. In other words, the Union's losing the war, and this is a desperate measure that's going to lead to more lives lost. This is a common argument that you're going to hear in the South, that all you're doing is giving people a vain hope that they should be rebelling. We're going to have to put that revolution down, and you're literally signing the death warrants of slaves across the Confederacy. P.G.T. Beauregard, Confederate general, calls for the execution of abolitionist prisoners to meet this Emancipation Proclamation. Let the execution be made with the garrote, he says. Now, despite that, there are still some people up north who support emancipation and abolition who don't like the message. Here's from the Commonwealth, a newspaper. Whatever we looked for, we certainly have got a very awkward and wiry proclamation. It must have required considerable ingenuity to give 2.5 million of human beings the priceless boon of liberty in such a cold, ungraceful way. The heart of the country was anticipating something warm and earnest. One could scarcely imagine that the herald of so blessed a dawn should have caught none of its glow. Instead of an embrace, we had a gruff, stay where you are. Mr. Lincoln does indeed call it an act of justice. But if he had been in a dentist's chair, he could not have made a worse face as it was extracted from him. On the other hand, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the poet, liked Lincoln's political skill. The extreme moderation with the president advanced to his design, his long-avowed expectant policy, as he chose to be strictly the executive of best public sentiment of the country, waiting only till it shall be unmistakably pronounced. So fair a mind that none ever listened so patiently to such extreme varieties of opinion, so reticent that his decision has taken all parties by surprise, whilst it is just the sequel of his prior acts. The firm tone in which he announces it, without inflation or surplusage, all of these have bespoken such favor to the act. Great as the popularity of the president has been, we are beginning to think that we have underestimated the capacity and virtue which the divine providence has made an instrument of benefit so vast. Frederick Douglass, too, talks about this. The proclamation itself was throughout like Mr. Lincoln. It was framed with a view to the least harm and the most possible good in the circumstances, and with a special consideration of the latter. It was thoughtful, cautious, and well guarded at all points. While he hated slavery and really desired its destruction, he always proceeded against it in a manner the least likely to shock or drive him from any who were truly in sympathy with the preservation of the Union, but who were not friendly to emancipation. That's the political reaction. There's also a reaction that's somewhat mixed from legal scholars. In other words, can he do this? And it's mixed in the North. The issue is the Emancipation Proclamation applies to Confederate areas. It does not apply to border states such as Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland, where there's slavery. But military law, according to one Northern judge, martial law can only suspend the law in an area. You can't make new laws. Another former Supreme Court Justice, Benjamin Curtis, who is against slavery, says that a proclamation cannot make law and it cannot repeal law. The president doesn't have that power. So what you're actually seeing is that there's a possibility that if nothing else happens, and things will happen through the course of the war, but if nothing else were to happen but this Emancipation Proclamation, there's even the possibility that the Union will be restored, and so will slavery as it existed before the emergency. This is something that Lincoln considers himself because he suggests a number of amendments to the Constitution that Congress should pass, and one of them he suggests is to constitutionalize, to make an amendment that makes his proclamation have legal force. Okay, now, why am I talking about the Emancipation today? We've got a question from Terry O'Toole. On one of your recent casts, I thought I heard you say that the reason Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation was to repurpose the Union cause to make it more about ending slavery than resisting rebellion. If I heard that correctly or inferred it, can you elaborate on your reasons for so believing? I always thought that the primary purpose of the Emancipation Proclamation was to liberate slaves so they could join Union forces in some capacity, and at the same time deal a severe economic blow to the South by eliminating an important part of the South's economic base. The Emancipation Proclamation was not a declaration against slavery simply because it did not apply to slave states like Missouri, which had not ceded. Is that incorrect? He has more questions, which I'll address in a bit, but we'll stay on that emancipation for a bit. Yeah, I don't remember the specific episode, but it kind of sounds like me. I do think to some extent here in July of 1862, as he's approaching his cabinet, Lincoln is hitting the reset button on the war, Just like in so many wars, the initial enthusiasm that happens in the beginning where states are sending lots of recruits down and governors are real excited about the Union cause, is dwindling a bit, and he's looking for something else. And also, I believe he wants to have those military effects. Now, a couple notes just in the text of the document that some of the things that I highlighted, I'd like to point out a few things. One, yes, he does, in the text of it, label it a necessary war measure. And that's how he justifies it, perhaps politically, military necessity. Obviously, you're crippling an opponent that's fighting you. If your view, which was always the way Lincoln presented it, that these are states in rebellion or areas in rebellion where forces beyond the control of the legal force of the United States have the power, you're going to do what you can to upset that and use the weapons that you have. Notice, though, that I also highlighted two items, and one is forever free. So in addition to this being a very dry, you sympathize a little with that guy that said that it was like Lincoln was in a dentist chair, right? It's not a work of poetry. But there is a little magic, if you will, there, a little bit of thinking outside the box. He's saying forever free. That goes beyond the military necessity, even if it's justified as a war measure. He's not going to put them back into slavery, the people that in this proclamation he's announcing are forever free. Okay? The other thing I note is that when he lists all of those areas that are accepted from the Emancipation Proclamation, In other words, you take an area like Missouri or Kentucky. He says at the present, they will be treated as if this Emancipation Proclamation was not issued. Well, why does he even have to put that in there at the present? So there's hints in the document, but I really think to answer this question is the one thing is just to look at subtext rather than text, the context. It was a dramatic, radical proposal for the time, for 1862. That's not to say that there wasn't pressure to do it, but that pressure was coming from like one group of the Union coalition that was keeping Abraham Lincoln in power, that was keeping the war going, not all of the groups. Horace Greeley in August challenges the president with an article called The Prayer of 20 Millions. And he says, why are you listening to these fossil politicians in the border states? Why don't you listen to the bulk of the Union who want this? Why don't you argue for it? Why don't we fight for emancipation? And, what's your plan for the war? Why aren't you using the executive power? And Horace Greeley's like all the cable networks in one at this time. So he's a really important voice. And Lincoln answers him. Of course, Greeley prints the response. And he says, I would save the Union. And if I could save the Union by freeing the slaves, I'll do it. And if I could save the Union by not freeing the slaves, I would do it. That quote has been retained through history. You probably heard that in high school. And because of that quote, I think there might be a slightly off picture of where Lincoln's mindset is and how Lincoln truly felt that is drawn from that statement in response to Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley himself feels that he got the response too quickly, as if it was like prepared by the president, just waiting for Greeley to say something. But we also know that he had already told his cabinet about the Emancipation Proclamation he was planning. And so the response to Greeley, even though it offers those two options, freeing the slaves, not freeing the slaves, he had already decided on a course, by all accounts, before he even answers Greeley. And then he issues it the next month, in September, after the Battle of Antietam. The other thing to consider here is, where is Lincoln's mindset? Like, what did Lincoln really want? To kind of separate the politician from the person. And Lincoln says to friends, if slavery is wrong, nothing is wrong. He says this before he's president. He also says that a house divided against itself will not stand, that the country can't remain permanently half slave and half free. This is the whole reason he engages in those debates with Stephen Douglas about slavery. And Stephen Douglas's argument is, why can't it? Why can't states decide? And Lincoln is absolutely committed that at least in the new territories of the United States, there will not be slavery permitted. However, he's pragmatic. He even goes as far as to propose a 13th Amendment, but not the 13th Amendment. We know it's a 13th Amendment. As he's coming into office, Republicans support and Congress passes a 13th Amendment that would prevent the emancipation of slaves in the Deep South. Not permanently, but a very long time. So it's, I believe it's 1900 or something like that. He's willing to go that far as long as slavery doesn't go into the new territories. But I think, and I believe Southerners would be the first to point out, that if you're against slavery in the territories, you're against the growth of slavery. And that's where Lincoln is putting himself. Some other things to note about Lincoln and his course on things. He's very concerned about Kentucky. That's where he was born. That's where his in-laws are from. He has seen that Kentucky's right on the edge. Northern abolitionists just hate the fact that Lincoln's so concerned with Kentucky. By the time you're getting to the Emancipation Proclamation, Kentucky's starting to get into Union control and not to be as much of a practical worry. Republicans do outlaw slavery in the District of Columbia. This has been a very contentious issue. And for the South, it's very important. It's going to be a little more important than it seems. I'll talk about it in a bit. It seems like a small area, but it has influence. So this is the one area where Congress can actually influence it, and they do. Also, it's the only area, as it turned out, where a compensation scheme will work, where actually slave owners are compensated for the emancipation. He also attempts to do this during his presidential term in Delaware. He is not successful. He even has the support of the largest slave owner in Delaware. Delaware doesn't have that many slaves, something like 1,000. It's a small state. The legislature will not go along, does not want the influence of the federal government. Finally, just 2 years from the release of the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln will call for and eventually get, using the strong powers of his office, a 13th Amendment banning slavery in the United States. And whenever something happens, we often don't look at the counterfactual, and we should, to understand truly the significance of it. That 13th Amendment banning slavery in the United States does no longer exempt Kentucky, Delaware, Missouri, anything like that. It's the entire United States now. So there's no thought in his mind with that 13th Amendment of rewarding states that stayed in the Union anymore. So you get the sense of where he went, at least, if the future's any indication of the past, in that way. I guess I'll close with a little bit. This is how Frederick Douglass, and he's writing in 1892, what he says about the difference between the language of the proclamation and what it really meant or what it was doing. For my own part, I took the proclamation first and last for a little more than it purported, and saw in its spirit a life and power far beyond its letter. Its meaning to me was the entire abolition of slavery, wherever the evil could be reached by the federal arm, and I saw its moral power would extend much further. It was, in my estimation, an immense gain to have the war for the Union committed to the extinction of slavery, even from a military necessity. It is not a bad thing to have the individuals or nations do right, though they do so from selfish motives. I want to read a little book from a book called The South vs. the South. I like this book. William W. Freeling, who talks about how the South really fought itself in the Civil War when you consider Southern Unionists, when you consider border state Unionists, and when you consider freed slaves and others who contributed, that it was almost half the South fighting another half of the South and the Union, etc. It's kind of his thesis. It's maybe summing up too much. He notes that in addition to these kind of general political or celebratory reactions to the Emancipation Proclamation, there were real practical effects that belie that argument that because emancipation affected the Confederate states, that had no effect. One thing you have to consider, it should always be considered, is that to some degree the slaves in the South freed themselves. Now maybe the fact that the Union Army was entering the South and that a defense had to be put up and people were leaving plantations, white males were leaving the plantation that otherwise would be overseeing them. They had the ability to run, but they were running. And they were in many cases running towards Union lines. And there would be different reactions depending on what general that was. Some turned them away. Fremont, over in Missouri, declared that Missouri was to be emancipated, and that was overturned by Lincoln before he issued the EP. Same thing with General Hunter in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. His order for emancipation was also reversed. But Benjamin Butler had devised a way of seizing slaves in the area under his control in Louisiana as contraband. See, and then it didn't sound as bad, but you were still kind of, in a way, replacing one owner for the other. The slave owner is now the federal government. But you had a lot of action around this time. Once it is announced in January 1st, 1863, you also have to consider the impact that it had, because Lincoln adds something to that, and that is the verbiage allowing blacks, former slaves, into the Union Army. And that affected the border states as well in an indirect way. Lincoln deployed more federal patronage than even secessionists had envisioned. Here again, the Army gave the commander-in-chief his allegedly missing anti-slavery weapons. The new troop recruiting business far outstripped the previously bigger federal business, the post office. Republicans who sympathized with voluntary state emancipation were given the appointment of marshal provost for recruiting. In the borderlands, before the war, half of Maryland's blacks had been freed. Washington, D.C. beckoned the other half. In other words, we talked about that earlier, Washington, D.C. became free of slavery. Well, it obviously became a magnet for those running away because you created a place where they could run to. Army camps and Army recruiters attracted and sometimes seized runaways with increasingly invasive procedures after mid-1863. Then in 1864, with the administration feeding patronage to white politicians of the Republican stripe, the staggering institution collapsed. In November 1864, Maryland became an exclusively free labor state. Missouri whites wiped out their last shred of slavery 2 months later. In Kentucky, 40% of Kentucky's able-bodied male slaves served in the Union Army. These 24,052 black Kentuckians ranked second in number, only barely to Louisianans among Union Southern black recruits. Kentucky's black soldiers freed not only themselves, but also eventually their wives and children. Freeling points out something else that's interesting. Delaware kept its handful of slaves. Why? Because the Union Army never occupied this almost totally Unionist state. The seemingly odd holdout of Delaware, the least enslaved states, reemphasizes the critical point. An attracting army and cautious runaways together secured abolition. Fugitive slave style, whether in the Mississippi Valley or in the borderlands. Terrence O'Toole asked me another question I want to address. On the larger subject, there seems to be a fierce debate these days between liberals and conservatives over the underlying cause of the Civil War. Liberals say it was a noble, high-minded moral crusade to end slavery. Conservatives, especially Southerners, say it was economically driven by Northern business interests, which viewed not just slavery, but the Southern economy and culture generally as a threat to the rapidly industrializing economy of the North. I have many thoughts about that question, and it gets to what the cause of the Civil War is, so I will address that. The first thing that strikes me is everything now is like kind of left and right, so whenever there's an issue, we go down one or the other neural pathways, and never the twain shall meet, and that's kind of what's going on with so many issues. But left and right really is not descriptive enough for a lot of things, and it would be a shame, a kind of malnutrition of the history here, if somehow that Civil War issue could be boxed up in those terms. For instance, to think that left would be exclusively north and conservative exclusively south, it becomes kind of silly when you consider that the North was where all of the big business was. Sure, on the issue of slavery, I get it. It'd probably be a more liberal thing, obviously, to be for abolition. But big business, banking, was the way in the North, and some of the people leading the Union War effort and financing it were the big financiers, and there's going to be a lot of fist shaking at them in the 1870s and 1880s as they start to do some bad things and have some scandals, in addition to some of the members of Congress that are sitting in there right now. And then on the Southern side, absent the issue of slavery, absent the enslaving, which moderns, of course, would consider horrible, I would consider horrible, would not be a very liberal thing, there is yet a little bit of some issues in that battle that we might consider liberal. Like, for instance, a Southerner back then considered the Yankees, considered the North, and particularly the New England area, Boston, boasting Massachusetts, they would call it, to be haughty, to be thinking they were morally superior, to be telling them what to do. There was a kind of libertarian streak in the arguments too. So all of that is to start with, that applying the left and right now is just not a good way to do it. But this is how we do things now, right? High and noble. There were some people, probably on both sides, that were going to war for high and noble reasons. That's always something that's a little suspect. There were certainly abolitionists joining. There were moderate people who at least wanted to suppress slavery joining the cause, but it did not represent all of Union forces. When we consider all the arguments before the war, that on both sides, this was thought of as something that was going to be over quickly. And so there's this whole thing that you can consider that doesn't fit into any easy left-right box, because it's both a pacifist and also a horrible issue of compromising with slavery. But it's the question that could be raised is, should the war have been fought at all? Perhaps should have been the South just been let to be. I think Greeley at one point writes an article to this, then he changes his mind. But it's like, let him go, There's a lot of people, the only argument I make, there's a lot of people by the time you're getting to 1865, and there's a lot of death and lives destroyed and homes destroyed and treasure lost from this war, that certainly had a different view of that question than they did in 1861, when I believe on both sides they thought it might be over in a few months, and the South was confident that they would get, just like in the American Revolution, there would be European powers intervening on their side to protect their Confederacy. We'll talk about that in a second. And it didn't turn out that way. The key issue of what drove war, so the Union going to war for slavery, that someone would have to think twice about making that argument. We didn't get to the issue being slavery at all, really, until 1862. The noble part of the Union's argument for war, if it is to be phrased in those terms, is not a war against slavery initially in 1861, but a war to preserve the Union, a war to put down an insurrection, all right, a call for troops. It's no different, like some of the mentality of it is no different than there's a fire over there and we need some people to help put it out. And that was certainly Lincoln's thinking. He always used the term rebellion, not fighting a foreign country, refused to see things that way. To not tolerate the seizing of federal property, of federal forts, of an insurrection, of the post office, the mails, of armories and equipment, of diplomatic powers in treating with foreign countries, of all of those things. That's the justification from Lincoln's side, from the Union side. But from the Southern side, I do believe that slavery is, that's where I come down, that slavery was the overwhelming issue that led to the spark of war. It's not to say that the fact that one side was industrialized and the other wasn't, it wasn't a big issue. It was. It's not to say that tariffs weren't a big issue. It was. But the secession starts with the election of a single president. There was an attempt to really negotiate on tariffs or industrialization, and the spark of actually taking arms is slavery. If the argument's about states' rights, it's, well, states' rights to do what? And for the Southerners, it was, well, let's just listen to the Mississippi Secession Convention here. Whereas they, the people of the non-slaveholding states, have elected a majority of electors for president and vice president on the ground that there exists an irreconcilable conflict between the two sections of the Confederacy, they mean the Articles of Confederation in that sense, in reference to the respective systems of labor and in pursuance of their hostility to us and our institutions, have thus declared to the civilized world that the powers of the government are to be used for the dishonor and overthrow of the southern section of the great Confederacy. Therefore be it resolved by the legislature of the state of Mississippi that in the opinion of those who constitute said legislature, the secession of each aggrieved state is a proper remedy for these injuries. 9th January 1861. Now, I think a particularly important event is the Virginia Secession Convention of April 1861, because you have a short period after Lincoln is sworn in where Virginia has not seceded yet. There are two different conventions. At first, Virginia says no to secession. It's more hesitant as a state than the fire eaters in South Carolina or Mississippi say. But it's when Lincoln calls for volunteers to put down the rebellion. and he gives Virginia a quota of 3,500. It may be a mistake, but Lincoln's view, one thing you're always going to get from Lincoln is that he doesn't want neutrality. All right, he might, be willing to give Kentucky a little slack to allow slavery in places, but he doesn't want neutrality in terms of the Union, so he's going to ask for a quota from everyone, whether that was a political mistake or not. You also have to consider that Jeff Davis was calling out volunteers as well to defend. So this was in reaction to that. Virginians, though, after this call to arms, led by Governor Henry Wise, call another convention. And Virginia joins the Confederacy on a vote, not unanimous, 88-55. There's a lot of people in Virginia who are against this. They're from West Virginia. They're from Arlington, seacoast areas. It's a brave vote, by the way, in this convention to be against secession, because you have to consider that Governor Henry Wise is a duelist who, during his speech, pulls out his horse pistol. And also you have to consider that Harper's Ferry and Norfolk were already seized by loyalists and well supported by Governor Henry Wise at that time. As he says, he set the wheel in motion already. So you already had some action there. During that convention, though, to make their arguments, Mississippi sends the Honorable Fulton Anderson. And here's what he says. In the first place, I say that the North hates slavery, and I use the expression, the North hates slavery, designedly. Hate is the feeling, and it is the whole North that bears it. That this is true of the Black Republican Party at the North will, I suppose, be admitted. This is how they commonly referred to the Republican Party. A few of the proofs which could fill this room will, I think, be sufficient to satisfy him. The first consists of 3 sentences from a speech of Mr. Lincoln's made in October 1858. They are as follows. I've always hated slavery as much as any abolitionist. I've always been an old-time Whig. I've always hated it, and I've always believed in the course of ultimate extinction. And if I were in Congress and a vote should come up, I would vote that it should. He goes on and on and on, but first of all, it shows you where at least Southerners viewed Lincoln was. Not so pragmatic and moderate, but actually a representative man, as Anderson says, against slavery, willing to subvert the Constitution, as Anderson says. In the speeches of 3 commissioners, Anderson from Mississippi and also the commissioners from Georgia, and the commissioner from South Carolina to the Virginia Convention, again, trying to convince them what the cause is for, why they should secede, there are 77 references to the word slavery. So I think it's the paramount issue. This is replicated by a lot of the secession conventions. This is replicated by some of the Charleston Mercury, which is that fire eater type paper in Charleston that was really fomenting rebellion in the first state that did. I think it was the key issue. However, I do want to point out that even in that convention I just referenced, there is a pitch about industrialization. Why will Virginia not take the place now held by New England and furnish to the South these industrialized goods? Bear in mind that the manufacturers consumed by the South are mainly manufacturers of the United States. These manufacturers now monopolize nearly our whole market by virtue of the tariff on foreign importations. Will Virginia not take this place? I ask, is it not to the interest of Virginia and the border states to take this place? Most assuredly it is. So I do think, as a side issue, tariffs were very interesting and important, and especially this commissioner from Mississippi is trying to convince Virginia, hey, we're going to make you the new New York. We're going to start buying things from you instead. But in making that argument, he also makes another one, which kind of belies the tariffs argument for the cause, that the question is, will the protection which you will get for us be sufficient to build up your manufacturers? What does he mean by protection? Tariffs. And I say, I think it will. Now, he can't be bound to this. He's just one commissioner from Mississippi, but he's representing the view to this convention that needs to decide. He's essentially telling Virginia, we're going to make you the new New England, we're going to make you the new New York, and we're going to give you that tariff protection that they now get. So is this really an issue about tariffs? Is this really an issue about, in other words, they're willing to pay a bit of the price that tariffs do cause a price increase in goods to establish industrialization in Virginia instead of New York. My view on the industrialization argument is that, look, the South didn't have it, but I also feel like they had strong partners across the ocean that did have the parts that they needed. Their crop was cotton. They supplied something like 80% of the cotton to Great Britain. There's a huge depression, particularly in the mill towns. Millions of people are getting their employment from industries involving around southern cotton. And when it goes from 80% of imports to 3% during the war, when they can't get anything through the blockade, it takes a while. Eventually, they're able to find some sources in India and Egypt and places. It's never as much as the South was providing. So that king cotton was very powerful. And I believe one of the things that drove Southerners to feel confident about the war, and then their ability to finance off it, to sell cotton bonds, which were sold in Paris and London and Amsterdam. So I guess all that leads me to believe that if it's just an argument that we're powerless and we don't have any business strength, I still think that argument seems weaker to me. And I believe the real argument was, despite all the cultural differences, comes down to slavery. Terrence also asks about the Reconstruction. I'm just going to have to save that one for another episode. But thanks, Terrence, for the question. I'd like to talk about it. We got some other issues. A reminder about the premium podcast from My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. I've got all kinds of topics up there that we're talking about. I've been sent a number of books from publishers. Sometimes I can't always get the person on, or don't have time for an interview, or think it's right. But I do want to use some of these books. So one of the things I got, Ambassador Wendy Sherman's book. So she's going to talk a bit about Cuba. She's going to talk about Iran, negotiating deals, being a woman involved in diplomacy in Washington. And I'm going to read some segments from that book and talk a bit about that. Just have some leftover notes from some of the previous casts that I recorded. There's not always time to talk about everything. And, during the midterm cast, we read from Frank Carpenter's 1880s articles, and his look at life in D.C., and we read from that during that cast. I have some more readings from his book, some interesting observation, and also a bit of talk about people returning money to the Treasury. I don't know if people know that this goes on. Things like that are on the premium cast. I hope you'll consider supporting the show and also getting a little bit of extra content. To all of you who have, thanks very much. Do it as much as you can. If you can't, if you're not in a financial position to do so, don't. But it can be as little as $2 a month. It can be more if you want more. You get archived episodes. If you've subscribed and you somehow haven't gotten the email, that alerts you and gives you your own special RSS feed to plug into your podcast app in order to get the premium podcast, please let me know. And we will contact us on the website at www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com, and we'll get you all set. Thanks for listening.